Hello, everyone. We were just waiting a few minutes to get everybody into the room. Welcome to this event, uh, in the Silicon Valley Talk series about seeing Silicon Valley with Fred Turner and Mary Beth Meehan. I'm Henry Lowood. I'm the Harold C. Hobach Curator in the Stanford Libraries. And as the head of the Silicon Valley Archives, I'm very pleased to welcome all of you here. Let me begin with a few acknowledgements. First, as always, to the late Harold Hobach and the Hobach family for the generous gift that created the Silicon Valley Archives program fund that made this possible. Second, to the co-sponsors of this event, the McCoy Family Center for Ethics and Society and the Digital Civil Society Lab of the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, which is also known as Stanford PACS. And last not least, Spencer Gondorf of the Silicon Valley Archives and Sonia Lee and Gabrielle Carampelis of the Library Development Office for their work in making these events happen. Okay, before I introduce our speakers, let me remind you that the book we'll be talking about today, Seeing Silicon Valley, Life Inside of Fraying America, is available from the University of Chicago Press. If you order from the press on their website, use the coupon code Stanford, all in caps, when you buy it, and you'll receive a 30% discount. But please don't run away to do that right now, despite the discount. We're going to talk first with the authors. Here's the drill for today. After I introduce Mary Beth and Fred, I'll ask them a few questions about their book project. And after about a half hour or so of that, we're going to turn the conversation over to your questions. So please feel free at any time during the event to submit those questions via the Q&A button in the Zoom webinar interface. We'll collect those and then ask them when we get around to the Q&A session. Okay, so let's introduce the speakers. First, I want to introduce Mary Beth Meehan. Mary Beth is an independent photographer, writer, and educator who has spent more than 20 years embedding herself in communities across the United States. Her works combine texts, images, and public installations, and have taken her from her native New England, I believe Mary Beth is in New England right now, across the Midwest, the American South, and as we're going to hear more about today, Silicon Valley. She's also lectured and led workshops at the School of Visual Arts in New York, the Rhode Island School of Design, the Massachusetts College of Art and Design, and the Missouri Photo Workshop. And now Fred Turner. Fred is Harry and Norman Chandler Professor of Communication at Stanford. He's also professor by courtesy appointment in the Department of History and Art History. Besides co-authoring the book we're talking about today, Seeing Silicon Valley with Mary Beth, Fred's also the author of Echoes of Combat, Trauma, Memory, and the Vietnam War, which came out with the University of Minnesota Press in 1996. From Counterculture to Cyberculture, Stuart Brand, The Whole Earth Network, and the Rise of Digital Utopianism, which I assume every one of you has read. University of Chicago Press, 2006. And The Democratic Surround, Multimedia and American Liberalism from World War II to the Psychedelic 60s with University of Chicago Press again in 2013. Hello, Fred and Mary Beth.
Welcome. Hi, Henry.
Hi, Henry. Thanks for having us.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm over the moon to have both of you here, and let's get started. I know you're going to show us a few photographs in a minute, Mary Beth, but before we do that, I wonder if both of you could kind of set us up for a few minutes. And let's start with the question, how did the two of you come to collaborate on this project? Different coasts, different lines of work, all of that. How did that happen, and what were the goals that you set out with the project?
Sure. Mary Beth, do you want me to jump on it?
No, you start first.
Okay, great. So, yeah, about 4 years ago altogether now, I was here at Stanford, and, I'd been writing about Silicon Valley mythology and advertising for a long time. And I'd come to realize that the place I live in Mountain View, a few miles away from Google. The place I lived was quite different than the place being depicted in the press. And I'd always wanted to work with photographers. I've always wanted to do that. I've been a fan of photography for a long time. I've written about it quite a bit. And I wanted to try see if we could kind of reveal the world that was here. And the thinking in my head at the time was that, if you were living in 1620 in Plymouth, Massachusetts, surrounded by pilgrims, a historically important site, what would you, as a historian, want to collect, make visible, show the world about that place? And living at Silicon Valley at a time when we're actually building the technologies that are having a transformative, though not necessarily beneficial, effect on the world, I know that I really wanted to do that. So I wanted to kind of reveal the world that's here. And so began talking with different photographers and was lucky enough to be introduced to Mary Beth, who has turned out to be the perfect person. And I'll say one word why before I turn it over to her. You know, Mary Beth is coming from the East Coast, from industrial America, from Southern Massachusetts and Providence, Rhode Island. And I think she has an eye for this place that someone who spent a very long time here couldn't have, in addition to all of her own, you know, just photographic chops. But Mary Beth, over to you.
Well, thank you so much for having us. And Henry, you know, I was working on a project in Noonan, Georgia, and an old friend and colleague named Elodie Maillet, who was then a Knight Fellow at Stanford, called me on the phone out of the blue and said, there's this professor I'd like to introduce you to who's interested in doing this project in Silicon Valley, and this was Fred. And we had a number of phone calls and talking about, could I go there and use my photography and my writing and the kinds of work that I had been doing in the South, but mostly in New England, as you said, where I live, to look at Silicon Valley as a real place with real people. And, you know, my first thought was, oh my God, why me? Like, what could I possibly have? You know, Silicon Valley, you know, I was just as blown away by these ideas and myths that Fred has tried to dismantle as anyone else. What on earth could I bring to Silicon Valley? And my little son, who was 11 or 12 at the time, said, well, can't you just go and talk to people like you always do every other place? Like, isn't that what you would do? And so, you know, I sort of agreed that this process could work there. And Fred and I embarked on the project.
Well, I'm going to assume that most of the audience has not read the book yet. So it probably would be good here for you to maybe show us a few of the photographs.
Sure.
And also, you know, we're here in this web format. If you could also say something about the way the book is put together, the composition and the format of the book, and how it all came together in that format.
Sure. So yes, I would love to start by showing you a few pictures. And let me. So is that good? Can we see Irfan? Okay. So, you know, I received this call in the spring of 2017, and we decided that in July that I would go out and do a little visit, and Fred and I would meet and sort of kick each other's tires and see if this project would work. And so I stayed in an Airbnb in Mountain View, and I'm showing this picture of Irfan because she was the first person I met. I was in this Airbnb. We didn't even know if this project was going to work. And, you know, I went on Zillow and I found out that this little sweet little bungalow, 2-bedroom bungalow in Mountain View was worth $1.2 million, which of course blew my mind. And I thought, and so I had never met Irfan or laid eyes on her, but we had been messaging through Airbnb. And I said, you know, I'm working on this project. I'm just trying to get my feet wet. Can I make a portrait of you? And she very graciously agreed. And I went around to the front of the house and we started this series of conversations. And her husband is an engineer at Google. They'd come all the way from Iran via Canada to Mountain View. And when I said, I'm trying to do a project that really kind of materializes what life is like here, she said, oh yeah, I really want to talk about that. And she sat me right down and brought me some tea and said, it's really hard here. We feel really insecure. It's $1 million isn't that much money. A Google engine, you know, it's extremely competitive. Everyone in Iran thinks I'm really rich, but I'm living in this 2-bedroom bungalow, half of which is Airbnb, to try to make ends meet. So people beginning with Irfan were forthcoming about what life was like. And through it, I sort of tried to piece together a narrative and look at sort of the materiality of what life was like there. You know, Irfan's family on her phone, her grandmother's pearls. The beginning, I was just sort of casting about what could I photograph to make this place feel human, to sort of show the humanness of it. This is Imelda. When I went back in the fall to work with Fred, I lived in an Airbnb in Menlo Park, and I saw Imelda coming out of a house across the street with a cleaning bucket with another woman. And I ran up to her and said, you know, I'm doing this project, my same spiel. I'm working on this project, what life is like. Would you be willing to talk to me? And we met, and She agreed to have her portrait made, and she gave me an address to meet her, which was on a corner in Redwood City. It was a gas station in Redwood City. We met at the gas station, and she brought me back into this little driveway where she was staying in this trailer in a friend's, at a friend's house. And so slowly I was sort of, this is her bedroom, slowly piecing together this narrative person by person and getting involved with groups like Silicon Valley Rising and people who are working for workers' rights, which was kind of the first entry place for me. This is Victor, who lives in a trailer along Rengstorff in Mountain View. So learning about the Day Worker Center in Mountain View and the people that they serve, and then the people who make up that community there along Rengstorff. But then not wanting this to just be, here's Teresa, who you know from the cover of the book, who was working at a food truck in Palo Alto, and who had come from Mexico and was living there with her 4 daughters. But we knew that this, and Abraham and Brenda, who live in a trailer along where the Stanford campus is, all that whole big long row. And what they talk about in the book is that it's sort of worked out. They lost their house in the crash of 2008. Things have worked out. They were living in improvised shacks that had to be torn down by order of the police. And they just decided, let's take our savings and live in a trailer. And so they live along the Stanford campus. And except on the day of a football game, when Stanford clears them out, it sort of works okay, but there's not running water. These are not, they don't have services. But what we realized was that the press had sort of covered the tippity top, Zuckerberg in that world, and the press was starting to get at the homelessness and the housing insecurity in the Valley, but that there was this whole middle range that we wanted our book to also address. So here's Richard, who made $140,000 in the auto industry at the plant in Fremont until GM closed. And when Tesla takes it over, he gets a job on the floor making $40,000 a year. And when he starts to organize workers for the union, he gets fired. Here's Ravi and Gautami, who have advanced degrees, and they come all the way from India, and they get into the pharmaceutical industry, and they've got a whole 1-bedroom apartment for $3,000 in Foster City, and they're thinking, how are we gonna have a family here? This is what we can afford. Justina, who comes to the Valley with an advanced degree from Poland, having won a White House award for her work in AI and self-driving vehicles for a disaster response, realizing disaster response, we're supposed to be making the world a better place. I've got this great idea for disaster response, but nobody's going to fund it because this is capitalism and it's not profitable. Disaster response is not profitable. So now she works with AI, in self-driving cars. Fred, jump in if I'm missing, forgetting.
No, you're definitely getting it. I'll say a few words at the back end about how the book as a whole is organized, but this is great.
So here's Constance. It was really important to me to talk about how public servants who work in these cities, Constance is a teacher in Menlo Park, how teachers, fire, police, they will all tell you that they can't afford to live in the communities that they serve, that they commute 2 hours one way and 2 hours home, that it leads to this kind of breakdown in social relationships in which they don't feel that they can adequately address their communities because they're just not physically there on the ground. Constance is now living in an apartment that's subsidized by Facebook in this experimental sort of housing project that they're doing right now in Menlo Park. But there's some uncertainty as to how long that's going to continue. And this is Warren, who's someone who really loves Silicon Valley and was a valedictorian in his class and went to Stanford and got a business degree and has done well there as a venture capitalist and as a small business owner. But he talks about how he doesn't want to grow his company as big as something like Facebook because he sees that some moral and ethical lines need to be crossed there if you're going to prioritize that kind of endless growth and size and power. And it's something that he's deliberately chosen not to pursue. Mark, whose mother worked in the electronics industry in the 70s and who had a miscarriage, and Mark was born with severe birth defects that were directly linked back to her handling lead in the technology industry. All of that manufacturing, which has now been offshored to Asia and isn't actually happening in the Valley. And then this is Cristobal, who is a full, he was born in California. He served 2 tours in Iraq. He's in the US Army. He works full-time via a contract agency, which is a whole other issue, for Facebook as a security guard. And we met, he was introduced to me by someone with Silicon Valley Rising because he had become quite an activist for workers' rights. And we met and had dinner, and I did, I do long interviews with everybody that I photograph. And then mostly after the fact, I go and meet them, and he sent me his address. And like Imelda, I met him at the front of the house, and he brings me around to the back to this shed that he's living in. He wasn't living in the house. He was living in the shed in the back. He has a full-time job at Facebook. He served 2 tours in Iraq. And he said to me, this trickle down thing is not working. It's not what's happening here. So that's just sort of a sample of the people I met and kind of how I found them. Let me stop sharing.
That's great. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Wait a minute. Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. It's okay.
Wait a minute. Let me get out here. There we go. There's my cursor. Okay. So anyway, just an introduction.
So Mary Beth, gosh, it's just so nice to see those images again. I just want to say to the folks who are assembled here that working with Mary Beth is a great joy because for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is that Mary Beth approaches people and is able to establish a kind of intimacy and honesty and frankness with them that I think is very hard to achieve. So the book, Mary Beth and I met every week during her visit here. She was a visiting artist here at Stanford. And I want to thank especially Matthew Tews and the Stanford Arts Initiative for helping make that happen. Also the Wallenberg Foundation, really appreciate it. And during that time we talked a lot, and what we ended up wanting to build was a book that had a kind of framing essay up front by me that talks about the kind of context of seeing and not seeing certain things in the valley. This is one of the most polluted regions in America, but most of the pollution is underground, so it's very hard to see. It's a place where we see the big tech, we see the people at the head of the big tech, but we don't see the folks that Mary Beth just showed us. And then, the images follow. There's, I don't know, maybe 60, 70 images. Correct me if I'm wrong, maybe even up closer to 100. And they have vignettes. Mary Beth spent a lot of time with each of the folks in the book, and they tell their stories, and Mary Beth captures those in text. And then as we built the book, we just edited the heck out of each other's work. It's the most collaborative thing I've ever done. I'm pretty happy with the way that it all came out. I think we made each other a little better. It was kind of neat.
If somebody were to make an assumption about how the book came together, they would say, Fred's written a lot of books. He was the text guy, and Mary Beth, you are a non-photographer. You were the image person. And Fred, you've just said a few words about how that came together. Do you think this kind of collaboration, which is sort of research and art, text and image, at these different levels, do you think this is something that was unique in your case, just because of your willingness to collaborate, mutual interests, or is there something here that maybe you'd like to encourage other people to try out?
Yeah, I really want to encourage. Mary Beth, may I start on this one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so Henry, I really want to encourage folks. I think we live in a time when we're being bombarded by images, and the digital world in particular is building itself out around the globe in the kind of semi-invisible networks of kind of electrical circulation. We have server farms that are hidden far away from us. We have Wi-Fi in the air. It's all kind of invisible. And I think that we have an opportunity to kind of return to a combination of classically analog media, text and still photography, with an eye to revealing the actual lived material conditions that technical world is producing. When I see Mary Beth's work, and one of the things that I think I hoped for was, some echo of the Farm Security Administration projects of the 1930s. We want to show the actual lives of workers. Or August Zander in Germany and Austria worked very hard to kind of map the different kinds of people who were living in that time. I think that photography has a unique ability to do that. And one of the things I'm very grateful for here at Stanford is that Dean Satz and the university encourage public-facing scholarship and public-facing work. And I think Mary Beth in particular has a way of working in communities that I would love to see travel. But Mary Beth, maybe say a bit more about that.
Well, no, in terms of the collaboration, it was really amazing working with Fred. And believe me, we've had our scraps and everything, so we're not going to just clean it up for you all here. But they were all generative and wonderful in the end. But I'll tell you, you know, I have worked in journalism and received assignments that it was my job to illustrate. And I've also done my own independent work and gone out and tried to find writers, tried to find people who could illustrate those ideas. And one of the things we really wanted to stress, you know, the cover of the book says Mary Beth Meehan and Fred Turner. I mean, we really co-authored this. And what I mean by that is, you know, Fred had done the research in the beginning and he invited me out there with a certain framework to begin with. But over this course of the 6 weeks, I would go out on the street and do my thing, and he would be doing his thing, his office. And then weekly we'd have these dinners where we'd talk and we'd sort of say, well, what is it that you're seeing? And what is it that this means? And we really wrestled with it through to the end. So the ideas were generated over the course of the collaboration. And, you know, it sounds very neat that we ended up with this book, but at the end of those 6 weeks, we didn't know what we had. And we sort of just decided to throw faith to the wind and make what we were at that point. I don't know if you remember, Fred, we were kind of calling it a poem. Like, Fred, what if you write all this stuff that we talked about with the pilgrims and the pollution and everything? And what if I put these vignettes and photographs together and then let's see what we have? So it was really this organic thing that came out of this back and forth. And Fred was wonderful to work with. I mean, you know, it really did grow out of that.
So now I have a couple questions for each of you individually, and then we'll go to the audience questions. Okay, Fred, I'll go with you first. The introductory essay that you mentioned is called The Valley on the Hill. Mm-hmm. And in it, you draw these parallels between Silicon Valley and the Puritan ethos. You refer specifically to John Winthrop and his, you know, his famous City Upon a Hill sermon/speech. So please just draw out a few of the implications of this comparison for us. How does that vision relate to Silicon Valley?
Sure. So I think one of the deepest myths of California is that it's a country apart from the rest of the United States. And we tell that story all the time here in the Valley, and marketers for the Valley do that for strategic reasons. They say, you know, look, we're inventing the future out here. You folks back in Washington and Philadelphia and Boston, you're a little behind the times. Let us do our thing. Don't regulate us. We'll bring you technology that changes the world. Well, you know, as they do that work, they are invoking a classic Protestant ethos that came to America with the Pilgrims in the 17th century. And that Protestant ethos is very specific. It carries with it a theological notion that God has decided who's going to go to heaven, and he's going to reward those people here on earth with wealth. And so people start building, growing, building companies, keeping an eye out for wealth as a sign in the 17th century that they have been chosen by God. Well, I'm here to tell you that's the logic, or a core logic, inside Silicon Valley. When we see Mark Zuckerberg, when we see Steve Jobs, especially Steve Jobs now that he's gone, we are seeing people who are being made saints, and the evidence of their sainthood is the wealth that they've accumulated. And you know that carries with it all kinds of discrimination. The Puritans of the 17th century were largely white Europeans. They thought the Native Americans around them were demons, devils. You know, we're working on land here in Silicon Valley where generations of Ohlone natives were wiped out, first by Spanish settlers and then by American settlers brought in from the East for the purpose of killing the Ohlone. It's a long and bloody history. Likewise, the land here, which in a Puritan ethos is sort of a God-given stage for the performance of our chosenness, the land looks beautiful. It's absolutely spectacular. I'm looking out my window now and I see green hills and palm trees, mind-blowingly beautiful. But I also know from when I bought a house that the first thing you do when you buy a house is look at the Superfund site map to make sure that you're not building on top of an underground pollution plume. And so what I wanted to capture was the sense of this place as a home of an American dream, one of the deepest American dreams, the dream of being an example to the world by virtue of being chosen and making things that will show our chosenness. And to step back and say, well, no, wait a minute, this is actually a real down-to-earth, on-the-ground place. And that mythology that we've brought in all the way from the 17th century is causing us to not see the actual world, the actual community that we're building. And that's especially why I wanted to work with Mary Beth, because she sees and literally making visible the things that are obscured by that mythology. That's what I wanted to do. And one last thought, Silicon Valley may really be a city on a hill. It may really be an emblem that the world is watching to see how the future should look. Right. If that's the case, then we need to be alert to facts like, you know, during the pandemic, 40% of families here in Silicon Valley, the wealthiest region in the world, or one of them, 40% of families in this region are not guaranteed to have enough food to eat every day. This is a region with more than 70 billionaires with a B. And yet, 4 in 10 kids can't be sure they're going to have enough to eat. I find that infinitely disturbing. And that's the kind of thing that we need to make visible here.
So, Mary Beth, in light of all of that, was there a specific style of photography that you were going for in the project? Was there something you were trying to get at with the particular way you were framing the individuals you were capturing? And was that, informed? How was that informed by what Fred was just talking about?
Well, it's interesting that Fred's talking about August Sander. I mean, I came up in photojournalism, and in newspapers and magazines, and sort of this idea that I could arrange myself around what was happening in the world to capture it candidly, which we know is a myth, because as soon as there's a photographer on site, there's a performance that happens and there's an interruption of life that happens. So I had moved away from that kind of candid look and really started exploring this direct portraiture. And I had been working on that in Providence and working on it in Georgia when I received the invitation to come to Stanford. And so it felt like here in Silicon Valley, a combination of really trying to interact with the person that I'm photographing and make a direct portrait that captures that connection, but that allows for some of the space and some of the environment to be part of the images, so that the people are standing for themselves as individuals, but as a collective, the whole ecosystem of the space is seen somehow.
Yeah, I just want to jump on that. I think this is something, Mary Beth, that you and I have talked a lot about, which is trying to make visible simultaneously the human beings, the people and their lives, and the systems that are shaping those lives that are otherwise very hard to see as connected to the people who are actually on the ground.
We talked a little, Henry, off before we started, a little about this question of advertising, and does that inform the work? And I would say that in the moment of the encounter, I had a teacher years ago that said, you do all your reading, and you do all your research, and you're thinking, and you're strategizing for what you want the work to do. And then you stuff that away in your left brain. And in the moment of photographing, I'm really just like, oh my God, this person and this light and this color and this moment, and trying to be with them in a way, I really believe that the quality of the encounter is transmitted through the images. So if I've bored the person or annoyed the person, or they're thinking about what they're having for lunch, that kind of glazed over thing comes right through to the viewer. So, I just try to keep myself engaged with a person for as long. You can't keep them that long. It's a lot emotionally, but to really make the photograph that exists in that moment that can somehow transmit that to the viewer. That's my goal.
Yeah, for the audience, I'll just add there just my personal reaction, which is that even though the book has many critical aspects to it, there's a lot of struggle that you read about in the book, and hardship for people, that you also in your photographs let a lot of positive energy from those people shine through, so that you have this mixture of the difficulties that they're facing and also their perseverance and the other qualities that they bring to their lives in the valley. And speaking of them, I want to ask both of you your reactions to a couple of things that two of the subjects in the book said, and I wanted you to maybe explicate them a little bit. And the first was from Mary, who came to the United States from Uganda. She talked about how there were many people here who are poorer than anybody she grew up with in Africa. She talked about how everybody takes care of everyone in the community there and so forth. And she concluded by saying, "This place is lonely," meaning Silicon Valley. Was that a recurring sentiment that you got with the people that you interviewed and photographed? And also, for either one of you, what does that mean? What is lonely about Silicon Valley?
It was a recurring. I'm thinking about a woman who actually is the woman that introduced me to Richard, who talked about how hard it was to make friends there. She has children, and the children go on the play dates. And she told me about how she went to visit a friend, a child, friends of the children. And she went and she thought she was going to be sort of interacting or having a cup of tea with the dad. And the dad sort of opened up his laptop and started working. And she was there with the kids and sort of a little bit destabilized by that. So I can't generalize about how people who live there feel in terms of loneliness, but I do think a recurring theme was the difficulty in making a human connection that was sustainable and creating a feeling of community.
Yeah, I'll jump on that too, Henry, from a slightly different angle. So I was really both impressed and surprised as Mary Beth did her work. We would meet each week to hear about the kind of anxiety and solitude in her subjects. And that was across classes, across races, across occupations. I found that really interesting. And this is a pretty interesting region, right? 40% of the people here were not born in the United States. That's a big deal. So it's a very mobile region. I'm struck by the power of the individualistic ethos here. We're supposed to make it on our own. We're supposed to have special genius. And that's really challenging because so much of what makes our lives work is community. And we're living in a region where people are building, quote, communities in digital spaces, that are very thin by any human standard. And to do that, they're living hyper-individualized lives in a region where we could have much more connected, actual lived relationships with one another. I've certainly experienced senior tech folks going to a taqueria and completely not seeing the person behind the counter. And that's something that we need to sort of put an end to. I think we also just need to call out the inequality over and over and over again. If some people make so much more money, that's one thing. But if they make that money and the people that you see in our book who work for them, with them, support them, live in trailers at the edge of campus or live in tents, we are not succeeding as a society. We are not building a good community. If Mark Zuckerberg wants to build a great community, he needs to do some of that work offline. I think that's really important. Last thing, same thing's true for my home institution. I'm sitting in my office here on the old quad. I'm looking out the window at the building where the Google algorithms were written. I'm literally looking at the origin of Google out the window. But I know that when I get on my bicycle and ride home today, I'm going to ride by a whole slew of trailers at the edge of campus who are people working in support of companies like Google. And I think it's an open question. How do we, all of us, help this place become a model of a more humane and more human community, and not simply a place from which we build technologies that claim to give us community, even as they tend not to?
Okay, one more. And Fred, you already touched on part of the answer to this next one, but I'm still going to ask it so that you can throw in any final thoughts that you have before we go to the Q&A from the audience. This is Justina, who's the woman you saw in the first photograph in the slide deck.
Yeah.
PhD in engineering science, grew up in Poland, got her PhD in Germany, works on these self-driving automobiles, everything that you already described, Mary Beth. But she says, you quote her as saying, "Now, as I look around, we seem to be losing ourselves. If we want to achieve excellence in technology, why can't we achieve excellence in being good to each other?" How would, as your concluding thoughts, how would you flesh that out a little bit more, both of you?
Well, I think, that to align that a little bit, Henry, with your previous question, I mean, I don't know if I held this up. Did I hold this up? Here's Richard, who worked at Tesla and again, making $120,000 a year 10 years ago, and now 40,000. I mean, the way the money is distributed has a distinct impact on the health of the community. And so Richard is saying we're organizing in the union because we just want it. We're not trying to break these companies. We just want enough money for a cooler of beer, a paid vacation to take our family away. If you are driving 2 hours in one direction to be a fireman in Palo Alto, and then you're driving 2 hours back, you're not participating in the softball league in Palo Alto. You don't have time to create the fabric of community that Mary talks about as being a sustaining factor in a village of Uganda, where there isn't the kind of money, obviously, that there is in Silicon Valley, but that there is a non-financial, holistic, human value to that presence, to being able to afford to be on vacation, or to be able to afford to be on a softball league in your community after 5 o'clock because you live there, that there's a non-tangible quality of importance there. And I think that Justina is talking about that, Mary's talking about that, Richard's talking about that, and Cristobal's talking about it when he's saying this trickle-down thing is not really what's happening. So whatever's happening to the money that's siphoning it off at the top, that's stressing out and destabilizing the workers, not only at the bottom, but in the middle on down, is having this effect on the community. and has human, spiritual, and I mean, human and spiritual, and I would say moral implications.
I would agree with everything Mary Beth just said, and I would I guess try to answer the challenge this way. You know, I think we're at a time when there are short-term things we can do and long-term things that we have to do. Short-term, I think we can think about trying to redistribute wealth, and we can think about trying to prevent the sort of social pollution that some of our media are causing today. When I think back on the kind of classic examples that the world we're inhabiting are like, I think back to the oil industry, to Standard Trust, to Standard Oil back in the early 20th century. I think about DuPont in the middle of the 20th century. These are companies that got very big, and certainly in the case of the oil companies, were broken up because they were so big, because they were mistreating their workers, because they were polluting the landscape. We are inhabiting a world where, beautiful as it is, in part because it is so beautiful and so hard to see the work going on, we are in fact abusing workers. Ask anyone who's worked in an Amazon plant recently.
Or read Richard.
I was going to say, right, yeah, read about Richard at Tesla. Yeah, exactly. And we are building systems that arguably are undercutting democracy. Those are not things that we should be proud of, and those are things that we need to change. Longer term, Henry, my own commitment, and we need people on every part of this job. It's not like there's one thing we can do. My own commitment is here at Stanford to working with students in computer science and engineering who are going to become the leaders of this new world, to make sure that they have in their educations not simply the latest coding skills, but a rich understanding of history, a rich understanding of their obligations to the communities they're a part of, a rich understanding of what it means to do business on behalf of all people and not simply on behalf of shareholders.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to some questions from the audience then. And there are a few now. I see there's quite a few questions here. Let's go to the first one. There's also a comment. I just wanted to say how incredible these images are and how you've captured the humanity and dignity of your subjects. I've worked in Silicon Valley since 1983 and never known the stories and people you're revealing. Why are these people and conditions so invisible to people like me?
Well, I mean, I think, compassion goes in all directions. And when you're busy going to your job and paying your mortgage and raising your children, I mean, I had all this time where my expenses were covered to be able to do this kind of investigation. So on one level, everyone is busy, is busy living their lives and trying to make it. So you can't be blamed for not knowing. I mean, on the other hand, I think we do have, and I'm not going to speak for the person asking the question, but I mean, we do all have to work through our preconceptions about who people are. We have an idea of what Silicon Valley is, of how things are working for people, and we don't ever have an occasion to pierce those or to question them. And that's exactly what we wanted this book to do, was to do a kind of myth busting, to say everything that you think you know, everything that you actually didn't know, just set all that aside for a second and just consider this anew. So I think the question is not so much, how come I didn't know this? Well, maybe it is. But in addition to that, what do we do now that we do see it? How do we get this book into the hands of people who can shift economic policy and move the needle away from the shareholder and more toward community health? I mean, that's exactly what we hope will happen next, now that it's been seen.
I agree with Mary Beth, and I think we shouldn't fault folks for being busy. I'm lucky enough to have a job where essentially I'm subsidized to study things. And for 20 years, I've been able to study the Valley. And that subsidy has made it possible for me to see things I couldn't have seen otherwise. And I totally get that. At the same time, Henry, you and I both know that in the world of engineering, there's an emphasis on solutions, on technical solutions to social problems, on design solutions to political problems. And I think one of the things that happens here in the Valley, in private firms and in Stanford, is that we go looking for technical solutions to social problems. And as we do that, we surround ourselves with technical people. We seek out technical expertise. We begin to look for those people who, quite unconsciously, we see as saints in the classic Protestant sense, in the Puritan sense. This is where mythology meets daily life. And one of the things that I think we've got to do, those of us who work in and around tech, is just take a minute, step back, and ask not only what kinds of technical problems can we solve and what are your technical skills, but who are you as a person? And how is the company I'm working in or working with helping your life be better? I think we have to orient ourselves in that direction, and it's a challenge.
I would like to add something else too, and that is, I mean, all of those trailers that are lined up in front of Stanford's campus, like what does it take to drive by them every day and not see them on all of our parts? And you know, I have my own presumptions about who's living there. It was shocking to me to find out that these are working people living there. In fact, there's a woman, I was told by someone there when I photographed Abraham and Brenda, um, there's a woman who worked in the Stanford bookstore who was living in one of those trailers. So what kinds of games do we play with our own consciousness to be able to not really look at it? I mean, think of all the smart people at Stanford and all the money that's assembled there. If everybody marched out of their buildings right now and tried to figure out exactly who those people were in those trailers and what problems they were facing, I think that the people at Stanford could figure out ways to solve them. So it's just a matter of what prevents us from really looking in that direction, I think.
Okay, next question, very direct question. What is it that you feel has not been portrayed? What is missing? What did you miss in the book?
I've got thoughts on this, Mary Beth.
Go ahead, you go while I think.
Yeah. So, you know, it's a real challenge in putting together a project like this to be as comprehensive as you would like to be. You know, I think we were very focused on making sure that the middle, which had been left out of the discourse in so much of what we had been seeing, it was well represented. And I think we've done a pretty good job in, you know, mapping the spectrum of experience from the working class, the unhoused, on up to people like Warren, who are very successful entrepreneurs. We don't have Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, and those folks. We did have access to some of those worlds, but not those particular people. And I think we talked about, you know, not necessarily featuring those folks because that has been seen so very much. And I think that's something that we really wanted to downplay a little bit so that we could see the world that was actually here. You know, so I think those folks are missing. I'll just say that something that's a little hard to see is the playfulness of the tech world sometimes. And you know, so I've written a lot about Burning Man, for example, and you know, have your feelings about Burning Man, but it's a pretty darn playful place. And you know, I think we've tried very hard to capture a balance in the book, as Henry was saying, for things that we admire in the valley, things that are challenging in the valley, the humanness of the people who live here, and yet the sort of inequalities that the system produces. And I think we've done that about right. There is a sort of playfulness that I know I've experienced at places like Burning Man or sometimes in engineering labs that isn't necessarily at the center of the book. But I think that's about it. I don't know. And I think, for my own sense, I think the ways that we've managed to make visible people who've been unseen and patterns of living that are unseen has been worth that small trade-off. Mary Beth, does that make sense to you? I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm just going to interject real quickly. In the first category, there's Carolyn Caddis's book from now, 30 years ago, Portraits of Success, that captures that group. So, so they're covered pretty much. Anyway, Mary Beth, over to you.
I had a couple thoughts. You know, I have a voice. I had a voicemail from Yvette and Mark, who, you know, whose son was, I showed you the picture of, who was born with the brain damage, and she, you know, and she said, it just, the book, I've read every page, and it just feels like what it feels like to live here. And, you know, thank you for putting our experience out there. And what I realized was, I'm proud of the fact that we really stayed focused on the human, what it feels like to be human there. I mean, I have my teenagers, I hope, are watching. I don't know, I think they're watching. I have an argument every day about an iPhone, an Apple Watch, somebody's attention span, somebody, you know, every day those objects have created tension in my house with these two teenagers. And we very deliberately did not go there. The kind of psychological effects of the devices themselves that are being produced in Silicon Valley. And I'm glad we didn't get distracted by that we stayed just really focused on what it feels to be a human there and how those companies have created community or have destabilized it. So, I mean, I think that those choices were deliberate, and I feel that it's somewhat complete. I mean, you could always do more.
Okay, next question. I just made the mistake of looking at the number of questions that are queued up, and I'm not even going to tell you the number, but I'll move forward. Next, I lived in Palo Alto and worked in Silicon Valley as a marketing consultant in the 80s and 90s. I moved to North Carolina as a result of the rising housing prices. How can these prices be sustained, and are there solutions being worked on for the area so that the quality of life for most people can be substantially improved? Is that something either of you would like to comment on?
I think that's on me.
Yeah.
I know a little about this, not a ton. So I think that the housing values are a product of kind of a classic industrial concentration model. You know, we're in a valley literally bounded by mountains, and we're in a place where the valley itself tends to be organized around in micro regions around different firms. So there's a kind of Google and search support region. There's a Facebook and social support region. And that's pretty hard to change. I mean, if you want to have a high density of people so that you can exchange information very rapidly, there starts to be a lot of value in living right nearby. You know, my neighbors in my immediate block work at a variety of firms, including Facebook. And if I want to be doing business in those spaces, I can literally go next door, knock on the door, and ask a question of a very senior Facebook engineer. That's the kind of thing that only happens if you live in close proximity. And so I think the incentive to keep costs high is very high. Now, different cities have taken different approaches to this, and they are busy building housing for workers. They're negotiating with developers to have some portion of that housing available to lower end workers. You know, my own experience of city councils has been somewhat depressing. You know, I keep thinking, I've been at meetings where it's very clear that developers have a very loud voice, and some of the folks that are in our book have no voice or very little voice, and that the meetings have been structured in ways to produce that outcome. And that's been incredibly distressing. I will point to two groups. The folks who make the Silicon Valley Index are doing an awful lot of interesting work in this space. And one individual Stanford graduate has been a hero in this space. I want to name him, and that's Lenny Siegel. Lenny Siegel in Mountain View has been just tremendous in finding ways to support people, bring in rent control. He's a grad from our university, and someone we should just be incredibly proud to know.
Okay, next question is specifically for you, Fred. I'm wondering if you specifically thought of a photographer to capture images of Silicon Valley who was not a resident in order to provide a neutral lens and perspective. The photography is incredibly beautiful, but also shows a dignity and humanity that honors the story of so many who are invisible to us in the Bay Area. So was that your thought? Did you have a thought to begin with like that?
I didn't think of it quite that explicitly. I did know that I didn't want someone who was already committed to making images of the things that we know best. So right about the time we were starting the project, National Geographic ran a series on Silicon Valley, and you know, really went very deep on Burning Man and cuddle puddles and the kind of hip undertones of elite tech counterculture. We knew that we didn't want to do that, and many of the folks, not all, but many of the folks in this region were already invested in different parts of storytelling. And I knew that I wanted to kind of capture the parts of the story that had not been told. I also just wanted someone who, without knowing it, I wanted someone who had a kind of warm sensibility and who had exactly the kind of vision that Mary Beth has. You know, and the vision I want to name is the vision that's both human and structural. You know, Mary Beth comes, without telling too many stories, out of school from a working class family in New England. And that's an industrial era place to come from. I know that world because I came from New England too. And from there, you can see things in our world, class, race, that are very hard to see if you're already invested in this location. So I didn't know that I needed that, but as soon as I met Mary Beth, it was really apparent.
That was a big shock, actually, that actually my roots in Brockton, Massachusetts could have lent me, I mean, although I do believe that everything I am today is thanks to Brockton, Massachusetts, anything at all. But you know, to have come from a working class background and to have seen and personally benefited from the kinds of security that could be amassed by working people in earlier economic eras, and to see that not happening in Silicon Valley was really shocking to me. The contrast that there was still stability to be had for working people in an earlier era, and that's just since 1980. You know, it's just not what's happening there. And Fred and I really are invested in making the point that this book is not just for people who are interested in what's happening in Silicon Valley, but if Silicon Valley is where the entire country's economy is headed, it's a little bit of a warning sign. Like, we are not headed to a place that's good for us all.
And we need to be.
Yeah.
So Mary Beth, you just set up very nicely the next question. I'm curious about other possible locations that might be similar in their appearance to others, similar or not in terms of the invisible people. Tel Aviv, Hyderabad. Might these other places have the same magic as Silicon Valley or reputation? If not, this could be even more remarkable. And so the basic question is, how different really is Silicon Valley from these other places in the world where these issues of invisibility and so forth might come forward?
Well, I think that we are always pushing against dominant narratives that are set up by the people who have the power to control them. I mean, right now, this country is in a reckoning of 400 years of perverse and negative and damaging narratives about the Black community on the part of the white people who wanted to be able to justify their abuse of that community. And so every community has its own distortions that need to be pushed through if we want to actually know who we are as a country or as a world. And what happens, we've seen what happens when we allow powerful people to speak for others, and when we don't really know who each other is, it can become quite dangerous, actually. We can see a young woman who's actually a college student, an American-born college student, or an immigrant wearing a hijab, and we can map onto that person that person's a personal threat because we don't have a personal relationship, and because that person's being spoken for by someone in power with a political or financial agenda to malign her. So, I mean, I think that in every community, the mandate is different. And so to go to Silicon Valley, the question for me was, what is it that needs to be seen here? It's not that people are invisible to themselves or to their families or to their communities. That's a little bit, I think that's a little bit of the white patriarchy speaking. No one's invisible to themselves or to the people who love them. The question is the truth of their experience in their life allowed into the dominant narrative, or has that dominant narrative been hijacked by someone with an agenda that is not producing a story that's accurate? And so my job is to push against those stories through photography and through words, wherever people will have me.
I want to echo what Mary Beth is saying, take it in one other direction. If Silicon Valley is a city on a hill or something like that, it reminds me also of London in the 19th century. Much of the way that the tech world works is in fact colonial. We have expanded our technical social media systems around the globe. Nations struggle. China certainly wants to build its own systems that are a little bit distinct. But we have built a global system for the harvesting of interpersonal data, the rebuilding of that data, and the monetization of the processes that we can build from it. If this is a colonial enterprise, then places like Silicon Valley and the kind of highly individualized entrepreneurial work styles that characterize it are also going to spread. And we see variations in Shenzhen, in Hyderabad. Many of our very best engineers here in Silicon Valley come from India. The training there is spectacular. Tel Aviv, likewise. And if we are going to spread this mode of working, then we're very likely, I think, to spread this mode of living too.
Culture, right?
And yeah, the culture. And in that context, then I think we need to ask, how do these different countries work? How do their cultures work? Where can they push back on this style? And how can they help us perhaps build a kind of community that's more humane than the one we have at the moment?
Okay, and now it's something different. Question for you, Mary Beth, about your craft. What are some of the specific things you do when approaching a subject and conversing with them to create a sense of trust and intimacy? How do you do that?
Oh gosh. Well, I'll tell you a funny story. So here's well, I'll tell you, I don't use a lot of gear. I have one camera, and I've sort of it's a Nikon that has a very high pixel, I'm not very gear oriented, but anyway, it's a Nikon that makes huge files. And I've sort of blacked out all the Nikon business on the strap, and I put black tape over I just don't want this camera to be a part of it. And so the camera has been made sort of not that visible. And it's just me and a camera and a bag and 2 lenses. And every once in a while I'll pop a flash, but I don't, to me, it's not about the gear. It's about, has this person willingly gone into this arrangement with me to share their image and their story? Can we can we breathe and take it all down to this nice calm space in which we're really trying to see each other? And then, I mean, I'm always looking for, I was going to tell you a funny story. So I was actually headed to Fred's house for dinner, and I stopped in I forget where I stopped, in Palo Alto, and I saw this beautiful woman going into a hairdressing salon. And so, I get this punch in my gut about people that I just want to photograph. That's the right brain part I was talking about earlier. And that's the crazy kind of artist part. Like, oh my God, look at that woman. She's amazing. Oh, and then I'm like, oh, damn it. When I get the kick in my stomach, but I'm hungry and I'd rather be at Fred's having a glass of wine, I'm like, oh, shoot, what do I do now? Do I honor the kick in the gut or not? So I walked around the block a couple times, and by the time I decided, all right, I'm going in there, this poor lady was her head was going back in the sink the hairdresser was washing her hair, and she was going back into the sink at the hairdresser's. And I said, excuse me, could I go speak to that lady? And so she kind of got up out of the sink, and I said, hi, my name's Beth Meehan. Here's my card. I had cards printed up with my phone, or here's my card. I'm doing a project in Silicon Valley. Could I call you? And she said, of course. And she sort of looked at me a little bit quizzically, and then she said, of course, darling. And she gave me her name and her number. And so this is Diane, and I called her, a week or so later. So, I mean, people want to be talked to. I think people, I don't know. It works. It works when I ask. I mean, not everybody wanted to be photographed, but I think people want to tell their stories, and they want to contribute to a narrative. And when you ask them what their lives are about, they know what they want to say. And so it's just a matter of making a space for that.
Yeah, that's impressive. I didn't know what the appropriate line was for when somebody's getting their hair washed, but now I know it.
Excuse me.
Okay, next question. I'm going to do a couple more. Then we'll be past about 1:30, and then I will ask you if you guys still have the energy to do a few more. Okay, so we still have, believe it or not, 3 dozen questions. So next question. Surely the answers we seek lie not in the boardrooms of the tech giants or the classrooms of venerable educational establishments, but in the hearts and minds of those working in grassroots social change. In the course of your work, did you find stories of social entrepreneurs who are really building the change? I assume that means now, building the change now, that we would want to see. Did you get run across anyone?
Talking about John or some other folks?
Well, I mean, I like a group like Silicon Valley Rising. I mean, do the answers lie there though? Because aren't those organizations in charge of creating enough disturbance that the people at the top actually make the changes? I mean, I think that there's a lot of people who are working in San Jose and throughout the Valley for workers' rights, for housing. There's a lot of organizations in the Valley that are working on those issues. But I think without the changes at the top, without the structural change at the top, which comes down to the money, I don't know how successful they will ultimately be. What do you think, Fred?
I have really mixed feelings about this. I admire a lot of the work that all kinds of folks have done. Maria at the Day Worker Center in right. Mountain View is a hero. Lenny Siegel, similarly. The Silicon Valley Food Bank, Second Harvest, very, very important organizations. And there's a lot of good work going on. At the same time, I sometimes wonder to myself why we're having to do that work in a world where we have right. more than 70 billionaires. In a world where I can drive up into the hills and see the kinds of haciendas, that only the dons of the 18th century might once before have built, or that maybe Hollywood moguls have. And so my sense is that the folks on the left in particular, but in social services more generally, who are pushing for change are doing great work, but they tending the poor and pushing for change in their lives is not sufficient. We need to push at the top very hard. And I think we need to use the state to do it. I don't see how else we do right. this. And we have done this before. We've done this with the oil industry. We've right. done this with railroads. We've done this with electricity. We have just built out a global infrastructure headquartered here in Silicon Valley. And we need to make sure that infrastructure and the companies and its profits support the people who build it.
Joe Biden's talking about unions. He's talking, I mean, all of that stuff that, I agree.
I'll go a little bit deeper and say I think one of the social myths that we inhabit in our moment in time was actually brought to us by the tech world. And it is the myth that loosely organized but passionate social networks can change the world. And I think that's a myth that grows out of the counterculture. And it happens if that network is sufficiently wired up and has enough money and has enough resources to leverage really institutionalized power, yeah, they might be able to change some things. And if you have the kind of social network that you can develop after 20 years in Silicon Valley, you might be able to change some things. But social networks are not enough by any means. We need unions, we need institutions, we need government agencies, and we need to stop believing, as Mary Beth pointed out, in the fantasy that the wealthy will simply let little drops of wealth trickle down to the rest of us. It doesn't work that way.
And I think we need a form of education too. So my cousin, I have a dear cousin who's sort of on the right wing. That was our challenge for the last 4 years, was keeping the relationship alive. But he when I talk about this book, he would get really angry, and he would say, well, why don't they get a second job? He believes that our grandfather worked harder than these people, that he was of a stronger moral character. Something about his moral fiber was more laudable than these people, that if they're not making it, they mustn't be working hard enough. So the difference is the invisible system that these workers have entered into in 2021 in Silicon Valley. And what I want is for that invisible system to be made visible and not have this political sleight of hand able to dismiss that. Let them get a second job. What are you talking? How can you get a second job if you're driving 2 hours back and forth? And many of them do. So whoever on this call knows how to shift that invisible system, that's whose hands we want to get the work into. Because you're right, it did happen. It happened with the robber barons. There have been shifts with FDR. We've seen the economy go in one direction and then correctives put in place. And so the country needs correctives to be put in place now.
So this is all set up the next question. Actually, it's 2 questions. I'm going to read both of them to you, but they're very similar, and it just gives you a sense of, something's going around in the room. The first is simply, what has the response to your book been like from those that have more, in scare quotes, here in Silicon Valley? And the second is, Fred referenced having some access to those in the upper echelons, again in scare quotes, though not Mark Zuckerberg level. Do you get the impression that those at the top have any idea about this issue? And if so, do they even care?
So, Mary Beth, why don't I start there?
I don't know any. I mean, you have to answer that one.
Yeah. So I think it varies case by case, and I think that one of the things that I've discovered, I was a journalist for 10 years before I became an academic, and doing that work and then again as an academic, I have rarely seen anyone who has done harm intending to do harm. It's actually surprisingly rare. What I've seen are folks who genuinely want to do the right thing, who believe they're doing the right thing, and who, as a product of some of those things, do harm. I haven't met anyone in the upper levels of the tech world who did not want to do the right thing. I have met people who have a very different understanding of what the right thing is and how to do it. And, so I used to spend a lot of time at Google. This was back in the 2006-07. And I was working on a project. There were some folks, and people on that project used to say, yeah, we're Google, don't be evil. And I said, well, okay, great, but what's good? And they said, well, providing information is good. Well, okay, who provides information? Oh, well, Google does. And so it turns out that not being evil means being good for Google. And that kind of logic, I think, permeates the Valley. I also think it's something that one of our earlier questioners pointed out, right? If you're in startup mode, let me tell you, you are living, eating, breathing startup. There is no room for anything else.
Right.
And, my colleagues who I know inside some of the larger firms, they may appear stable on the outside, but some of them scared to death, and they're hustling all the time. So, do they see it? I think it varies by person. They see it a lot less than I would like them to see it. I think that's a real problem. And I also think that many of the folks that I know, and I don't know that many, but the folks I know who inhabit some of these higher echelons, they trust in technology to be the source of change. They'll say, yeah, Fred, I get that the world is a complicated place and people are suffering, but I'm building this world-changing technology, and through it, I'm building a better society. Can I fix everything? No, but I can through my technology, fix this part. For me, that sounds a little bit like the famous line from the Tom Lehrer song. It is not my responsibility where the bombs come down, said Werner von Braun. And, if we're going to build the bomb, so to speak, we've got to own where they come down too.
Okay, so we're past 1:30. I think it's advertised to go till about 2. Are you up for a couple more questions?
Sure.
Okay, let's keep going. Okay. This might be for both of you, or it might be for each of you individually. The question is, what is your next project?
Hmm. What's your next project, Fred?
Well, I seem to be, so I'm getting more and more academic with age. And I seem to be lost in a project on the 80s at the moment, because I think the 80s was the time when our society began to fracture in some of the ways that we try to make visible in this book. So I'm really looking hard at that kind of fracturing and the role of media technologies in the process.
And Mary Beth?
For me, I was invited through a circuitous path. I was invited to Montgomery, Alabama to look at the community there, but in collaboration with a young artist based in Montgomery. And to me, as I get older, these collaborations are precious and I want to pursue them wherever they arise. And so she's a wonderful young photographer named Sydney Foster. And what we're trying to do is get funding to do this kind of work, but in Montgomery, which is her hometown, and really look at what happened to this cradle of the civil rights movement that we can't visualize beyond those old black and white pictures of Rosa Parks. Like there's a vacuum there in our national consciousness about Montgomery. And it's just such a special place. And so I hope we get the opportunity to work there.
Henry, can I say something about a fantasy project that I have that I hope Mary Beth would be a part of?
You know, yes. Okay. We'll have two individual projects and then a collaborative
and a fantasy project, right? So,
yeah.
So I think we're living at a moment of potential change in America that's akin to what the Depression was. I think we're living at a time when our industrial base is transforming, becoming ever more digitized. Class relations are shifting, racial relations are shifting. We are in a media world where we are seeing worlds very different than the ones we inhabit and yet have to come to grips with them. I think it's a moment when we need the kind of thing that we've tried to do in miniature in the book. We need to re-visualize our country. We need to literally see our country differently. We need to begin to understand who's here and what we have in common with folks whom we might otherwise be quite antagonistic with. So I would love to see a renewal of the Farm Security Administration project. I would love to see a world in which we can send 5, 10, 20, 30 photographers out to make visible the country that we inhabit and to make visible the fact that we depend on one another in it.
Mary Beth hasn't committed to it yet, so I'll move on here.
He takes me by surprise.
Yeah,
no, he's talked about the FSA before. I mean, I'm just thinking about, what would that look like, and who would we call? And right. I mean, I sort of went into practical mode.
Well, let me ask you another question, Mary Beth, from the audience. Do you have any plans to install these photographs in large-scale prints in public-facing spaces, as you have done with previous projects? Obviously, someone who knows your work. It seems like it would be a powerful next step for this work. Thank you. Do you have any plans like that?
Well, we have talked about this since the beginning, and we've fantasized about who can we get to pay for it. And we've also thought about how Silicon Valley is not like Providence, Rhode Island or Noonan, Georgia, where there is a downtown. What is Silicon Valley? It kind of gets at what is the there? What are the public spaces? And I mean, I think there's problems where if banners are installed, but they're all over the place and they're not in the context of the entire project, does that one person become sort of objectified or end up standing for something that's out of context with the rest of the project? So I think we haven't been able to get our head around the sprawling nature of Silicon Valley and how the work could have an authentic impact. I mean, I'm going to be doing I'm going to be in residence next fall at Brown University at the Watson Institute for International Relations, and they want to do a banner installation, which is a little bit weird because it's off-site, but it's also kind of wonderful because it would be in conversation with the curriculum that's happening at the Watson and what students and teachers are thinking about there. But in terms of in the Valley, we haven't been able to figure it out. Fred has a fantasy that one of the big, huge companies, go ahead, you talk about your fantasy.
Yeah, I'm a man of many fantasies. What can I say? So I mean, yes, part of me thinks that it would be wonderful if the tech firms of the Valley actually hung the banners around. But actually, I have a slightly different vision, and I would like to see the banners at Stanford. I think we are one of the engines for this Valley, and I would love to see us take ownership of and celebrate the full range of people who are here in the Valley, and really own our responsibility, our role in that community. And right now, Henry, and you and I both know, there are very firm rules around what you can display on the walls of the buildings at Stanford. And we have very firm rules about what color the roofs can be, because we're very brand conscious. And I understand why that is. I celebrate that. But I also know that when I ride my bike home, I'm going to be riding by a series of working people living in trailers, in part because of the ways that industries that we gave birth to here at Stanford are working. And so anyhow, I have a number of colleagues who are working with me on this. I'm hoping that we might be able to do a small show at the Haas Center. Perhaps my other fantasy is that we might be able to bring these images to the computer science building and put them on the walls as a decoration to remind us of why we do computer science.
There's
So
another little, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, there's another little factor that I personally hold, and I don't hold Fred to this, but if in my heart, the tech companies are causing the destabilization that we need this work in order to visualize, if they pay for the banners, do they get to look like they care about this problem that they're creating without fixing it? So I have kind of a dilemma. I have a dilemma about where would the money come from, and couldn't it be better used to solve some of the problems at the picture's surface?
So this next question is very similar to the one you just answered, but I want to read it anyway, just because of the content, of the way it's posed, and a little bit of the energy in the room, I guess. I really value this work. I live in Santa Cruz and I'm a faculty at UCSC and witness and call this out regularly. I'm also a parent and live in what feels like a maddening isolation in the context of values that are hyper-individualized. I've witnessed this magnify in the past several years. How can you mainstream your findings and images so that average people, i.e. outside of the academy, can learn from this work? This work humanizes this issue, but what we see are Teslas and multi-million-dollar home sales. How can you disseminate your findings in the area to raise more awareness? I think you've talked about that a little bit already. If there's anything else that comes to mind, feel free, but I can also move on to the next question. I just wanted you to hear that question to know that the things you were just talking about resonate.
Well, thank you. I have a quick answer for the Valley and then a larger answer.
Okay.
For the region, I mean, I think we're trying to do everything we can to get the book into the hands of the folks who have authority here in the Valley. We've been more or less successful doing that. I don't know if that will change things. I hope it will. I do think, though, that to the extent that Silicon Valley is, and the Bay Area more generally, including Santa Cruz, which is a major tech hub as well, are places that represent the future that America is becoming, then I think we need to start a larger enterprise. I would like to see us very much reach out to and be visible in things like churches, which is we're very secular here in Silicon Valley, but much of America, the social world and moral questions are raised in churches. We need to get this book and get these kinds of images into churches and into other kinds of institutions. And those of us who work in the hyper individualized world of Santa Cruz or San Jose or Mountain View, we need to begin to identify and become a part of and participate in and aggressively get to know communities where the values are different. And I know that's something Mary Beth has done throughout her life. It's something I'm doing in mine. And I think that's the best way to maybe not feel quite so alone and to begin to build communities that aren't quite so alone, of the kind that we try to make visible in the book.
I would say too that, the University of Chicago worked so hard to make this a very, very beautiful object. I mean, the book is very beautiful, but it's also $25. It was really important for us.
Before the discount.
Before the discount. But it was really important to us that this not be some big fancy coffee table book or prohibitively expensive art object. And so, for the University of Chicago will print as many as there is demand for. And so I think that to get the book into these spaces, my dream is that a church group or an academic institution or an academic department can buy a case of them and disseminate them as texts. There's also an e-version that's available online. So, I mean, first of all, thank you for that comment.
Yes, thank you for that question.
I can't tell you how gratified I am that someone who's there on the ground, who's been really working toward these issues, feels that this work advances that agenda. It's hugely the most possibly gratifying thing to hear. So I appreciate that. And I mean, use the book. It's cheap. The press will give that discount, and they'll print as many as are needed.
I'm going to there are two more comments I want to read to you and then one last question, okay? First comment, I see myself giving this book to everyone. Finally, a window on the world and neighborhood I live in as a resident in Redwood City. Thank you so much. I also appreciate you bringing in the mindset of the individualistic ethos that basically runs over the people who were here first and who did not see the inequality that has been created. Okay, that was the first comment. And the second comment.
Thank you.
That's what Melba.
Thank you for that. That's so moving for us. Yeah. Thank you.
And one more. Your project is of tremendous importance. Thank you so much for this contribution. It might be worth considering to implement this project in local middle and high schools in order to make the local youth aware of their immediate environment and educate them on the struggle. Palo Alto High School students are confronted with the sight of vans lined up across the street on a daily basis, yet they often have no knowledge about the reality of the invisible community members.
Let me just say that we've talked about developing a curriculum around the book. And if anyone on this call is working in a high school or would like to do that, they can reach out to me and I'd be happy to talk with them and figure out some ways to do that. I think that would be a wonderful thing to do. My own sense is that the tech world as a whole tends to be introduced to people only once they get to college. And if we need to be helping folks understand what computing is, what computer science is, but also what it means to build and work in this way together. And hopefully this book can help with that conversation. I'd love to be in touch with anyone who wants to do that.
Okay, the last question, I think this is an important one, and then we'll close it up. One of the prevailing stories in social sciences now is that the pandemic has made some of the invisible inequities more visible. Did you have a sense from the people you worked with that the pandemic exaggerated the precarity of their positions? Have you had any feedback from them? I know you took these photographs probably before the pandemic, but have you had any contact with the people you spoke to and how it's changed their conditions?
I have been in touch with the people in the photographs, but we have not really talked about that. I've not gone into depth about how the pandemic has affected them individually. So my only guess is that it has made the insecurity worse, but I would be guessing in terms of speaking on behalf of the actual people in the pictures. Fred, what about overall?
Yeah, I would agree with you, Mary Beth. And I think Henry, that one of the things the pandemic has done is made some of the challenges that regular working class folks face all the time, challenges that elite folks now have to face because they're not in the office. So now suddenly elite folks who might have had childcare arranged for them are having to be home with their kids, and it's hard and it's difficult, and you dress funny and all that stuff. My sense is that the frontline workers have been struggling all the way through this, as they have struggled elsewhere and at other times. So I want to be careful that we don't mistake the effects of the pandemic. We don't come to believe that the effects of the pandemic are somehow, once they're gone, the kinds of problems that we're surfacing in the book go away too. I think the reverse is true. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to stop there. I want to thank both of you, Mary Beth and Fred, for your book and for this conversation. I think you get the sense from these comments how people have reacted to the book and the kinds of emotions and thoughts that it's awakened just in this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Henry, for leading the Center for the Study of Silicon Valley. I mean, I think this the work you're doing makes these kinds of conversations possible, and I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. I do my best. Okay, so before I'll leave a few comments for the audience. There will be a closing panel when our images go away. Take note of a little bit of the information that you see there. First, again, there's going to be a coupon code for seeing Silicon Valley. You'll go to University of Chicago Press to their website. And when you buy the book, use the code Stanford in all caps, and you'll get a 30% discount. Second, you will see links on the final slide for the mailing list of the 3 co-sponsors: Silicon Valley Archives, the McCoy Family Center for Ethics and Society, and Stanford PAC. So please take note of those, and I encourage you to get on all 3 mailing lists if you're interested. Finally, you will receive a link to the video recording of this event in a few days. Please feel free to pass it around to everyone. I look forward then to seeing you at our next events, and have a good day.